Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before starting the video, please hit the subscribe, now this start video. As a longtime fan of the One Chicago franchise, I've grown accustomed to its thrilling crossovers, where the three shows, Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD, intertwine their storylines in a way that keeps the audience on the edge of their seats. However, the 2025 crossover event, titled In the Trenches, left me feeling disappointed and, frankly, a little frustrated. The event seemed heavily weighted in favor of one show, Chicago Fire, to the detriment of the other two series. In the past, One Chicago crossovers have been known for their well-balanced approach, where each show in the franchise plays a distinct role in contributing to the overarching narrative. There was always a clear sense of where one show's episode ended and the next began, with each installment having its own part to tell within the larger crossover story. But In the Trenches took a different approach, offering a much more integrated story in which characters from all three shows worked together right from the beginning of the 3-hour event. While the seamless integration of all three series was an intriguing concept, it ultimately left the crossover feeling unbalanced and skewed toward Chicago Fire, overshadowing Chicago Med and Chicago PD. From the very beginning, Chicago Fire dominated the crossover event. The story kicked off with Firehouse 51 responding to a gas explosion at a government building, and that explosion served as the catalyst for nearly every storyline that unfolded over the course of the crossover. On paper, this makes sense. Without the explosion, there would be no crossover. But the problem here is that the gas explosion set the tone for the entire 3-hour event, and Chicago Fire was given the lion's share of the narrative. As a result, the other two shows felt like secondary players in a story that was largely driven by the firefighters of Firehouse 51. Every other storyline in the crossover could somehow be traced back to Chicago Fire. For example, when Trudy, Amy Morton, gets shot during a police operation related to the gas explosion, the emotional focus of the story shifts almost entirely to Mouch, Christian Stolt, and his fear of losing her. While Mouch's emotional turmoil is important, there was little room to explore how Trudy's potential death would affect her colleagues at the police department, which felt like a missed opportunity. Similarly, Dr. Archer, Steven Weber, from Chicago Med was brought into the narrative mainly to offer guidance to Kid, Miranda Ray Mayo, over the phone as she performs an emergency procedure. Again, while Dr. Archer's expertise is important, the amount of time and attention given to his character felt disproportionate compared to the focus on Chicago Fire's main characters. I get that the crossover was likely designed to honor Chicago Fire's long-running success as the first show in the franchise. Still, it didn't take into account the impact it would have on fans of Chicago PD and Chicago Med, who may have felt sidelined in favor of Firehouse 51's gripping storylines. For viewers who don't regularly tune into Chicago Fire, the crossover might have been confusing, as it seemed to cater predominantly to the firefighter-centric drama. One of the most significant problems with In the Trenches was how the three shows were integrated into a single continuous narrative. In previous crossovers, there was a clear separation between the hours dedicated to each show. Fans of Chicago Fire would know that the first hour focused on the firefighters, Chicago Med would take over for the second hour, and Chicago PD would take the lead in the third hour. This format allowed each show to tell its own part of the larger story while still contributing to the overall crossover. However, In the Trenches did away with this structure, opting instead for a more interwoven narrative. While I understand the desire to create a seamless crossover experience, this choice ultimately worked against the other two shows. The characters from Chicago Med and Chicago PD weren't given a full hour of storytelling dedicated to their contributions, making their involvement feel secondary to the events happening within Chicago Fire. For example, Chicago Med's burn unit stories and Chicago PD's investigation into the gas explosion were happening concurrently with Chicago Fire's storyline. While this parallel story structure kept the action moving at a fast pace, It didn't allow each show the time and space to fully develop its narrative within the larger crossover event. Both Chicago Med and Chicago PD had intriguing subplots in the crossover, but they were left underdeveloped and overshadowed by the events in Chicago Fire. The conflict between Chicago PD's Voight, Jason Begg, and Chicago Med's Lennox, Sarah Ramos, was one of the most compelling aspects of the crossover. Voight's aggressive tactics clashed with Lennox's more by-the-book approach, leading to a tense standoff over the care of a patient. Voight's insistence on rushing Lennox to extubate a patient so he could interrogate her brought out the best of both characters, but their confrontation didn't have the follow-through it deserved. While Goodwin S. Epatha Merkerson backed Lennox's decision, Lennox ultimately compromised by giving Burgess, Marina Squarciato, critical information to help identify the patient without jeopardizing her care. This dynamic was fascinating, especially considering the history between the characters from their respective shows. However, the resolution felt rushed, and the subplot was relegated to the background in favor of more time spent on the Chicago Fire team. Unfortunately, this was just one example of how Chicago Med and Chicago PD got less time and focus in the crossover. While their contributions were important, they often felt like afterthoughts, with their characters relegated to the sidelines of a story that was largely centered on the firefighters at Firehouse 51. For fans of these shows, it was a disappointing oversight that diminished their impact on the event. Ultimately, the 2025 One Chicago crossover was a missed opportunity to create a truly balanced event that showcased all three shows in equal measure. The integration of the characters and storylines was certainly a bold choice, but it ultimately left Chicago Fire as the clear centerpiece of the event. While this may have pleased longtime Chicago Fire fans, it alienated viewers of Chicago Med and Chicago PD, who were left feeling like their favorite characters didn't receive the attention they deserved. As much as I understand the desire to elevate Chicago Fire, given its status as the cornerstone of the One Chicago universe, it's important for the franchise to maintain a sense of balance across all three shows. One Chicago has always been at its best when it emphasizes the unique strengths of each individual series, allowing for a collective narrative where everyone gets a fair share of the spotlight. That balance is what makes the crossovers so thrilling and enjoyable for fans of all three shows. When one series overshadows the others, it not only disrupts the flow of the event, but also leaves viewers feeling as though they're not getting the full experience they were hoping for. The format of this crossover, with its interwoven structure, could have worked better if there had been a more concerted effort to give each show its moment to shine. For example, the second hour could have been dedicated primarily to the aftermath of the explosion and the medical procedures that needed to take place, giving Chicago Med a chance to delve deeper into the characters and their professional dilemmas. Likewise, Chicago PD's involvement in investigating the explosion and dealing with the fallout from Trudy's shooting could have been more central to the crossover's third hour. This would have allowed Chicago PD to have more time to develop its subplot, making the interaction between Voight and Lennox feel less rushed and more consequential. What was most frustrating was how easily this imbalance could have been avoided if the crossover had followed a more traditional format, perhaps giving each show a distinct hour to tell its part of the story. Each series would have had the time to explore its individual narrative arc while still contributing to the larger crossover event. Instead, we were left with a 3-hour spectacle where the Chicago Fire team was front and center, while Chicago Med and Chicago PD struggled to find their footing within the story. Another issue with this crossover was the emotional depth, or lack thereof, given to the secondary characters. The focus on Mouch's fear of losing Trudy was undeniably powerful, but it often felt like the emotional stakes of the other characters were sidelined in favor of the firefighter-centric storyline. For example, while we got a glimpse of how Trudy's potential death affected Mouch, we never really saw the emotional impact it would have had on her colleagues in the police department. Similarly, Chicago Med's burn unit was featured but didn't receive the kind of depth it deserved to make the medical aspect of the story feel as important as the fire and police elements. The lack of focus on the emotional and professional challenges facing the Chicago Med and Chicago PD teams left me wanting more. The crossover event had so much potential to explore these characters and their intricate relationships, but instead, it often felt like their stories were secondary to the much larger narrative surrounding Firehouse 51. This imbalance not only hurt the crossover's overall impact, but also detracted from the connections fans have with their favorite characters from Chicago Med and Chicago PD.